this album sucks, but then again, you probably already know that. Metallica's Saint Anger went on to sell more than 2 million copies worldwide and debut at #1. However, in the process, Metallica alienated many of their die-hard fans for a couple of different reasons. For one, the uninspired drumming of Lars Ulrich and his steel kitchenware drum set, the lacking of solos, Bob Rock on bass, and uninspired songwriting. So 5 years came and went, and people were wondering if that was going to be the last album. Many people wanted it to be. However, whenever Death Magnetic was announced that it was going to be released, fans had something to be kind of excited about. Either that or be skeptical about. So was this album going to be something better than Saint Anger? Well, yeah, actually it was. This album was actually a lot better than Saint Anger.
Too bad that isn't saying much. Comparing Death Magnetic to Saint Anger is kind of like this. With Saint Anger, you have yourself one hell of a large lump of dog shit. And with Death Magnetic, you kind of have little pellets of rabbit shit. Either way, Saint Anger and the dog shit's worse, but the little rabbit shit still pisses you off. So you might be wondering, why does Death Magnetic piss me off? Does it piss me off at all? Well, actually, to be perfectly honest, whenever compared to Saint Anger, should I say, this album is amazing. But that, like I said, isn't saying much. That's the problem. The ceiling was not very high at all for this record whatsoever. In order for them to do better than Saint Anger, all Metallica really had to do was not write the same way they did during Saint Anger. And they actually did that. One of the very first things that they did whenever they announced the coming of this album was also announce that there was going to be someone else producing the album, Rick Rubin, as opposed to Bob Rock. Immediately, right then and there, fans should be excited, and they were excited because they knew that Bob Rock was not going to have the option or the possibility of ruining this album. Which means if this album was going to suck ass, it was going to be because of Rick Rubin and Metallica themselves. The album itself is 10 tracks long. There's special deluxe editions with bonus DVDs and bonus CDs and all sorts of other fun, happy bullshit. But really, to be perfectly honest, after an album like Saint Anger, just give me the goddamn album and let me listen to it. Well, I'll be honest with you guys. This is an album that doesn't really fit into Metallica's timeline in the kind of chronological sense that we've seen up until this point. What I mean by that is that whenever Metallica was, of course, Alcoholica or one of the big Bay Area thrashers in the 1980s, you sort of saw their music progress. Then, with Metallica, the self-titled Black Album, you saw them evolve into a band that was going to try something a little bit more poppy somewhat. And that just continued to be something they experimented with Load, Reload, and then, of course, the mother of shit itself, Saint Anger. However, Death Magnetic, on the other hand, almost turns back the clock a little bit. If I were to put this album anywhere in the chronology, I'd probably put it in between And Justice for All and the Black Album. Why? Because it has a lot of the hard-paced riffing that is really characteristic for And Justice for All, a lot of the lengthy tracks, and really just overall has a very distinct sound that reminds me a lot of And Justice for All. However, the semi-more poppy tracks, such as the singles, The Day That Never Comes, The Unforgiven 3, do kind of remind me a little bit more of Metallica's experimentation on the Black Album. Now, how is the songcraft on this album? Well, once again, compared to Saint Anger, it's fucking aces high. However, at the same time, these are still kind of lengthy tracks, and you know what, that's something that Metallica's always been known for, so that's not something that really should be that big of a nuisance. These are a little bit more creative than Saint Anger. There's a little bit more going on, so fans are actually going to be able to listen a little bit longer without being pissed off. However, at the same time, this is just a very average album. See, the one thing that was good about Saint Anger is that I could rant and rave about all the things that were wrong with it. With Death Magnetic, there's not much wrong with it, it's just not all that impressive. It's one of those albums where whenever you listen to it for the first time, and Saint Anger was the last thing that was in your mind with this band, of course it sounds amazing. However, now, whenever you listen to it just solo, you realize that there's nothing really all that special about it. Now, there's a couple things that should be noted. For one, Death Magnetic features the band's first instrumental track on an album ever since And Justice for All, Suicide Redemption, track number 9. It's almost 10 minutes long. Holy shit. Not to mention, this is the third album to feature an Unforgiven. Unforgiven was originally on the Black Album. The Unforgiven 2 was on Reload. Now, more than 10 years later, we have the Unforgiven 3. And overall, these songs are really not that bad. The singles that they chose, such as The Day That Never Comes and the Unforgiven 3, are chill-out songs. Really, The Day That Never Comes reminds me of this album's 1, so to speak, and the Unforgiven 3 really fits well in the series. It's a little bit more poppy of an album at some points, but it's definitely a whole heck of a lot heavier. Death Magnetic is one of those real, I would just say, mediocre albums that was put out, and whenever you compare it to everything else, it sounds great. However, whenever you actually stand it alone against some of the other albums by the other thrash metal bands that are out there today, it really doesn't compare. So let's actually look at some of these track listings. That Was Just Your Life, The End of the Line, Broken, Beaten, Scarred, The Day That Never Comes, All Nightmare Long, Cyanide, The Unforgiven 3, The Judas Kiss, Suicide and Redemption, and My Apocalypse. Honestly, it just seems dull. It seems dull whenever you look at it, and then whenever you listen to it, it's pretty alright. I would give it a solid 7, but at the same time, it's nothing special. So, what would I recommend for you guys? My recommendation for you is this. If you were a Metallica fan back in the 1980s, or if you are a fan of their 1980s work, definitely give this album a shot. But the one thing that I would say is don't expect it to be a thrasherpiece like those albums from the 1980s were. Definitely expect a lot of bumps in the road, and don't go into this thinking that you're going to be absolutely wowed. It's a decent record, but it's not great. So, I have to say this. Death Magnetic was obviously a success for Metallica, and obviously fans were willing to kind of accept them back into their musical palette. I told you at the beginning of this video that Saint Anger sold 2 million copies worldwide. Now, that's of course over a span of 7 years. It's now been only 2 years since Death Magnetic was released, and it sold over 4 million copies, and also debuted at number 1, selling 489,000 copies its first 3 days. So, I think it's fair to say that a lot of music fans really do understand what's up with this. They know that this is the better album between that and Saint Anger, and they're willing to accept that and prove it by purchasing the album still. However, at the same time, there's not too many people that I've talked to that whenever they are listing their favorite Metallica albums of all time is listing Death Magnetic at the top. So, basically, my recommendation, try if you want, try if you dare. You might like it, you might not. It's one of those rare cases here on the Cover Killer channel where an album is just pretty much average. And whenever you're talking an average Metallica album, well, that's basically like a 10 out of 10 after Saint Anger.